The morning sun cast a golden glow over the small chapel in downtown Denver as Sarah Martinez adjusted her wedding veil one final time. At 28, she had waited years for this moment, and everything seemed perfect. Her fiancé, Michael, Jen, stood at the altar in his crisp black tuxedo, his nervous smile revealing the excitement they both felt. The intimate ceremony was exactly what they had dreamed of. 50 guests, mostly family and close friends, gathered to witness their union. However, not everyone in the neighborhood shared their joy. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchinson, a 72-year-old resident who lived directly across from the chapel, had been growing increasingly agitated since early morning. The sound of cars arriving, guests chatting loudly, and what she perceived as excessive noise had pushed her beyond her limit. Eleanor had always been particular about peace and quiet in her neighborhood, and today's celebration felt like a personal assault on her tranquility. As the ceremony concluded and the newlyweds emerged from the chapel, rice and flower petals flying through the air, Eleanor watched from her window with mounting frustration. The photographer was directing the wedding party for pictures on the chapel steps, and the joyful laughter echoed through the street. Children from the wedding party ran around the courtyard, their voices carrying across the quiet residential area. Eleanor had lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years. She remembered when it was much quieter, when people respected their neighbors and kept celebrations to a reasonable volume. This wedding, in her opinion, was disturbing the peace, and she decided she had endured enough. The final straw came when the wedding party began taking group photos, with the photographer shouting directions and guests cheering loudly. Determined to put an end to what she saw as a public disturbance, Eleanor picked up her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was firm and indignant as she reported a noise disturbance at the chapel. She complained about the unruly crowd and insisted that the police needed to come immediately to restore order to her peaceful neighborhood. The 911 dispatcher, accustomed to handling various complaints, took down Eleanor's information and assured her that officers would be dispatched to investigate. What Eleanor didn't know was that her simple noise complaint was about to set in motion a series of events that would shock everyone involved, including the responding officers who had no idea what they were walking into. Meanwhile, Sarah and Michael were completely unaware of the brewing storm. They were lost in their own world of happiness, greeting relatives they hadn't seen in years and enjoying the congratulations of their friends. The photographer continued capturing precious moments, and the wedding party prepared to move to the reception venue just a few blocks away. The chapel's pastor, Reverend Williams, who had performed hundreds of weddings over his 30-year career, was chatting with the couple about their honeymoon plans. Everything seemed normal and joyful, exactly as a wedding day should be. The only sign of any potential trouble was Eleanor's stern face visible in her window across the street, but no one in the wedding party noticed her disapproving stare. As the last of the formal photos were being taken, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the chapel. Officers Martinez and Johnson stepped out of their vehicles, expecting to handle a routine noise complaint. They had responded to dozens of similar calls over the years, usually involving loud parties, construction work, or neighborhood disputes. Neither officer anticipated that this particular call would become one of the most memorable of their careers. The officers approached the chapel grounds, where the wedding celebration was still in full swing. They could see the happy couple surrounded by their loved ones. And honestly, the noise level seemed quite reasonable for a wedding celebration. However, they had a job to do, and someone had filed a complaint that needed to be investigated. Officer Martinez, a veteran with 15 years of experience, walked toward the group with a professional but friendly demeanor. He had learned that most noise complaints could be resolved with a simple conversation and a request to keep the volume down. As he approached the newlyweds, he noticed something that made him pause and look more carefully at the couple. There was something familiar about them, something that made him take a second glance. Officer Johnson, walking beside him, also seemed to be studying the couple intently. Both officers slowed their approach, their expressions changing from routine professionalism to curiosity, and then to something approaching disbelief. The wedding party noticed the police officers approaching and naturally assumed they were there for some administrative reason, or perhaps to offer congratulations, as sometimes happened in small communities. Sarah and Michael turned toward the officers with welcoming smiles, completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. The moment that would change everything was just seconds away, and none of the wedding guests could have predicted the incredible revelation that was about to occur. Officer Martinez stopped dead in his tracks, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. His partner, Officer Johnson, was equally stunned, his eyes wide with recognition. The two police officers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They both knew exactly who they were looking at, and it was impossible to believe. Standing before them, dressed in wedding attire and glowing with newlywed happiness, were two people who had been the subjects of a massive manhunt just 18 months earlier. Sarah Martinez and Michael Chen weren't just any ordinary couple celebrating their wedding day. They were former fugitives who had once been on the FBI's most wanted list. The story began 2 years ago when Sarah, then working as a financial analyst for a major investment firm, discovered a massive embezzlement scheme within her company. Her supervisor, David Morrison, had been systematically stealing millions of dollars from client accounts, covering his tracks through sophisticated accounting manipulations. Sarah had stumbled upon the evidence while working late one evening, finding discrepancies that led her down a rabbit hole of financial fraud. When Sarah initially tried to report the theft through proper channels, she found herself blocked at every turn. Morrison had connections throughout the company and had positioned his allies in key positions. Worse yet, when the investigation finally began, Morrison had expertly framed Sarah and Michael, her boyfriend at the time, as the masterminds behind the scheme. Suddenly, they found themselves facing federal charges for crimes they didn't commit. Michael, a computer programmer who had occasionally helped Sarah with data analysis, was painted as the technical expert who had facilitated the digital theft. The evidence against them seemed overwhelming, carefully constructed by Morrison and his accomplices. Their lawyers advised them that the case looked hopeless, and they were likely facing decades in prison for crimes they had never committed. Faced with a justice system that seemed stacked against them, Sarah and Michael made the desperate decision to run. They emptied their savings accounts, changed their appearances, and disappeared into the underground network of people living off the grid. For months, they moved from city to city, taking odd jobs and living in constant fear of being discovered. The FBI manhunt was extensive, with their photos plastered across news broadcasts and wanted posters. They were accused of stealing over $8 million, money that Morrison had actually hidden in offshore accounts. The media portrayed them as sophisticated white-collar criminals who had betrayed their clients' trust, making them recognizable faces across the country. During their time as fugitives, Sarah and Michael had completely transformed their lives. They lived in small towns, took jobs that paid cash, and slowly began building a new existence. Michael worked construction jobs and learned carpentry, while Sarah waited tables and cleaned houses. They lived simply, always looking over their shoulders, but gradually they began to heal from the trauma of their false accusations. The breakthrough in their case came 8 months ago when Morrison's scheme finally unraveled. A whistleblower within the company provided evidence that exposed Morrison's elaborate fraud, and a full investigation revealed the truth. Morrison had not only stolen the money, but had also fabricated evidence against Sarah and Michael to cover his tracks. When authorities searched Morrison's properties, they found the missing funds and documented proof of his frame-up. Sarah and Michael's names were completely cleared, and all charges against them were dropped. The FBI issued a public statement acknowledging that they had been wrongfully accused and were no longer wanted for any crimes. However, by that time, the couple had established new lives in Colorado, working honest jobs and planning their future. Together, they had decided to stay in Denver, where they had found peace and community. Sarah now worked as a bookkeeper for a local nonprofit organization, while Michael had started his own small carpentry business. They had legally changed their names back to their originals and were living completely legitimate lives, but they remained largely under the radar. The officers standing before them had been part of the original manhunt. They remembered the case vividly because it had been one of the biggest white-collar crime investigations in the region. They had studied the couple's photos countless times, visited their old apartments, and interviewed their former friends and colleagues. Seeing Sarah and Michael here, dressed for their wedding and surrounded by celebrating family and friends, was like witnessing people rise from the dead. Officer Martinez slowly approached the couple, his mind racing as he tried to process this incredible situation. He knew they were no longer wanted, but seeing them in person after all these months was surreal. Officer Johnson was equally amazed, remembering the long hours they had spent searching for these two people who were now standing before them as innocent newlyweds. Sarah noticed the officer's strange behavior and began to feel concerned. She recognized something in their expressions, a look of recognition that made her heart begin to race. Michael, too, sensed that something was wrong. After months of living in fear, they had thought their days of worrying about police officers were behind them, but the way these officers were staring at them brought back all those old anxieties. The wedding guests began to notice the tension in the air. Conversations grew quieter as people sensed something unusual was happening. Reverend Williams stepped forward, concerned about his newlywed couple and wondering why the police officers seemed so focused on Sarah and Michael, rather than addressing whatever noise complaint had brought them there. Officer Martinez finally found his voice and slowly walked closer to the couple. "Excuse me," he said, his tone careful and measured. "Could I speak with you both for a moment?" His years of police training kicked in, but nothing had prepared him for this bizarre situation. He was trying to balance his professionalism with the absolute shock of encountering two people who had once been among the most wanted fugitives in the state. Sarah's face went pale beneath her wedding makeup. She immediately recognized the look in the officer's eyes, the same look she had seen in countless law enforcement officials during their time as fugitives. Her hand instinctively reached for Michael's, squeezing tightly as her mind raced through possibilities. Had something gone wrong with their exoneration? Were there still outstanding warrants they didn't know about? Michael stepped slightly in front of Sarah, a protective gesture that had become second nature during their months on the run. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. The wedding guests behind them had grown completely silent, sensing the tension but having no idea what was causing it. Officer Johnson, meanwhile, was quietly radioing back to dispatch, not to call for backup, but to verify what he already knew. "Dispatch, can you confirm the current status on Sarah Martinez and Michael Chen, previously wanted in connection with the Morrison financial fraud case?" He kept his voice low, not wanting to alarm the wedding party unnecessarily. The response crackled through his radio. "All charges dropped 8 months ago. No active warrants. Subjects completely exonerated." Officer Johnson nodded to his partner, confirming what they both already knew but needed to hear officially. Sarah's mother, Maria Martinez, pushed through the crowd of wedding guests, her maternal instincts sensing danger to her daughter. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had spent years defending her children. She had lived through the nightmare of Sarah's false accusations and had never fully recovered from watching her innocent daughter become a fugitive. Reverend Williams also approached, placing a calming hand on Michael's shoulder. "Officers, if there's been some sort of misunderstanding, perhaps we can discuss this privately?" The elderly pastor had married hundreds of couples and had developed a keen sense for diffusing tense situations. He could see that whatever was happening was deeply personal and potentially devastating for his newlyweds. Officer Martinez took a deep breath and made a decision that would define this moment forever. Instead of treating this as a law enforcement matter, he chose to treat it as the extraordinary human story it was. "Sarah and Michael," he said, using their first names deliberately, "my partner and I were part of the team that investigated your case 2 years ago. We know you've been cleared of all charges and we know what you went through." The relief that washed over Sarah's face was immediately visible. Her knees nearly buckled, and Michael had to steady her with his arm. They had been living with the constant fear that somehow, somewhere, there might still be legal issues hanging over them, despite their official exoneration. "We spent months looking for you both," Officer Johnson added, his voice softer now. "We followed every lead, checked every possible hiding place. You two became like ghosts. We knew you were out there somewhere, but you had vanished completely." There was actually a note of admiration in his voice as he spoke about their successful evasion. Michael found his voice again. "We never wanted to run," he said, his words carrying the weight of all the fear and uncertainty they had endured. "But when everyone said we were going to prison for something we didn't do, we felt like we had no choice. We were terrified." Sarah nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she remembered those dark months. The wedding guests were completely captivated now, though they still didn't fully understand what was happening. Sarah's cousin, Jennifer, whispered to her husband, "Did she say they were fugitives? Our Sarah?" The story seemed impossible. Sarah and Michael were the most honest, hard-working people they knew. Officer Martinez looked around at the confused faces of the wedding party and made another decision. "Folks, what you're witnessing here is something pretty remarkable. These two people were wrongly accused of a serious crime, and they spent months as fugitives before the truth came out, and they were completely cleared. Today, they're celebrating not just their marriage, but their freedom and their vindication." A murmur of shock and amazement rippled through the crowd. Sarah's father, who had never spoken publicly about the ordeal, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. "My daughter and Michael are the most honest people you'll ever meet," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "What they went through was a nightmare, and they came out of it stronger and more in love than ever." Officer Johnson was shaking his head in amazement. "In 15 years of police work, I've never seen anything like this. We get called to a noise complaint, and we end up meeting two people who we spent months searching for, who are now completely innocent and celebrating their wedding day." He paused, looking at the couple with genuine respect. "How did you two manage to stay hidden for so long?" Michael exchanged a glance with Sarah before answering. "We learned to live very simply. We moved every few weeks, never stayed anywhere too long, always paid cash, never used our real names until we were cleared. It was terrifying, but we had each other, and that kept us going." Sarah squeezed his hand, remembering those frightening, but ultimately transformative months. The atmosphere began to shift as the incredible nature of the situation sank in. What had started as a tense confrontation was becoming something else entirely, a moment of closure, understanding, and even celebration. The wedding guests were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a real-life story that seemed too incredible to be true. As the shock of the initial recognition wore off, Officer Martinez found himself genuinely curious about the couple's incredible journey. "You know, we always wondered what happened to you after you disappeared from that motel in Kansas City. The trail went completely cold." He shook his head in amazement. "Our entire task force was baffled. It was like you two just vanished into thin air." Sarah wiped a tear from her eye, careful not to smudge her wedding makeup. "We were so scared," she admitted. "After Kansas City, we hitchhiked with truck drivers, slept in homeless shelters, and worked cash-only jobs wherever we could find them. We moved constantly, never staying in one place more than a few weeks." The memory was still painful, but sharing it felt liberating. Michael nodded, adding, "We had to completely change how we looked and acted. Sarah cut and dyed her hair. I grew a beard and gained weight from stress. We learned to pay attention to every detail, never using credit cards, never going to places with security cameras, always having an escape plan." He paused, looking at the officers. "We weren't criminals, but we had to learn to think like them to survive." Officer Johnson was taking notes, not for any official purpose, but because this story was unlike anything he had encountered in his career. "What was the hardest part?" he asked, his professional curiosity overriding the formal nature of their initial contact. "The isolation," Sarah replied immediately. "We couldn't contact our families, couldn't maintain any friendships, couldn't even go to a doctor when Michael got really sick in Nevada. We had each other, but we were completely cut off from everyone and everything we had ever known." Her voice broke slightly as she remembered those lonely months. The wedding guests were completely absorbed in this real-life thriller unfolding before them. Sarah's grandmother, a 90-year-old woman who had lived through the Great Depression and World War II, stepped forward with her walker. "Mija," she said to Sarah, using the Spanish term of endearment. "You never told us how bad it really was." Her eyes were filled with pride and sorrow. "We didn't want to worry anyone more than we already had," Michael explained. "When we finally learned that Morrison had been caught and we were cleared, we were so relieved, but also terrified that it might be a trap. We stayed hidden for another month before we dared to surface and reclaim our real identities." Officer Martinez was shaking his head in disbelief. "Morrison was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison last month," he informed them. "The investigation revealed he had stolen over $12 million, not the $8 million you were accused of taking. He had been running his scheme for almost 5 years before you discovered it." The officer paused. "You should also know that the company paid a huge settlement to both of you for the wrongful accusations and the failure to investigate your reports properly." Sarah's eyes widened. "We never pursued any legal action. Our lawyer mentioned it might be possible, but we just wanted to put the whole experience behind us and rebuild our lives quietly." She looked at Michael. "We never even thought about compensation. We were just grateful to be free." "The settlement was automatic," Officer Johnson explained. "The company's insurance covered it, and the FBI recommended it as part of acknowledging their mistakes in the investigation. There should be a significant sum waiting for you in an escrow account. You might want to contact the federal prosecutor's office." He smiled. "Looks like you two are going to have quite a nice honeymoon fund." The crowd of wedding guests erupted in surprised murmurs and scattered applause. Sarah's cousin Jennifer laughed through her tears. "Leave it to Sarah to get married and win the lottery on the same day." The comment broke some of the tension, and people began to smile and laugh despite the intensity of the revelations. Reverend Williams, who had been listening intently to the entire conversation, stepped forward with a thoughtful expression. "You know, in 30 years of performing weddings, I've never seen anything like this. But what strikes me most is how this experience has clearly strengthened your bond with each other. You faced the ultimate test of your relationship, and here you are, more committed than ever." Michael looked at Sarah with such obvious love and admiration that it moved several wedding guests to tears. "Being fugitives taught us that we could survive anything as long as we were together. We learned to communicate better, to trust each other completely, and to never take our freedom or our love for granted." He paused, smiling at his new wife. "Every day since we've been cleared has felt like a gift." Officer Martinez was genuinely moved by the story. "You know, we get called to a lot of situations where people's lives are falling apart, where relationships are destroyed by legal troubles. But you two, you came through something that would have broken most couples, and you came out stronger." He looked around at the wedding party. "This is actually a beautiful ending to a case that haunted our department for months." Sarah's father approached the officers with an emotional expression. "Officers, I need to thank you and your colleagues for continuing to investigate even after Sarah and Michael disappeared. I know you could have just closed the case, but your department kept digging until the truth came out. That persistence saved my daughter's life and future." Officer Johnson nodded respectfully. "That's our job, sir. But I'll be honest, this case was personal for many of us. Something about the evidence never felt right, and we couldn't let it go. When Morrison's scheme finally unraveled, it validated our instincts, but more importantly, it cleared 2 innocent people. The atmosphere had completely transformed from the initial tension to something approaching celebration. The incredible story had brought everyone closer together, turning what could have been a traumatic encounter into an affirmation of justice, love, and human resilience. The officers were no longer just responders to a noise complaint. They had become unexpected guests at one of the most extraordinary wedding celebrations any of them would ever witness. By now, the original noise complaint that had brought the officers to the chapel had been completely forgotten. Eleanor Hutchinson, still watching from her window across the street, was growing increasingly frustrated that the police officers seemed to be socializing with the wedding party, rather than dispersing them as she had expected. She had no idea that she had inadvertently set in motion one of the most remarkable reunions in local police history. Officer Martinez suddenly remembered why they were there in the first place. "You know, we should probably address the complaint. That brought us here," he said with a slight chuckle. A neighbor called about noise from your wedding celebration. He gestured toward Eleanor's house. Though honestly, after hearing your story, dealing with noise complaints seems pretty trivial. Sarah followed his gaze to Eleanor's window, where the curtains quickly snapped shut. We had no idea we were bothering anyone, she said genuinely. We can certainly keep the noise down. The last thing we want is to cause problems in our new neighborhood. Despite everything they had been through, Sarah and Michael had maintained their considerate nature. Actually, Officer Johnson said, looking around at the modest wedding celebration, this is one of the quietest wedding parties I've ever seen. Most of the celebrations we get called to are 10 times louder than this. He shook his head. Some people just don't like any disruption to their routine, no matter how reasonable it is. Michael had an idea. Officer, would you mind if we went over and introduced ourselves to the neighbor? Maybe if she knew who we were and what we've been through, she might be more understanding about the celebration. His suggestion showed the same diplomatic thinking that had helped them navigate their months as fugitives. The suggestion impressed both officers. Most people who received noise complaints either got defensive or angry, but Sarah and Michael were proposing to reach out and make peace with their complainant. It was another indication of the character that had helped them survive their ordeal with their integrity and tact. Sarah's mother, Maria, overheard the conversation and stepped forward. I think that's a wonderful idea, Mija. But maybe we should bring her something, a piece of wedding cake or some flowers from your bouquet. It's hard to stay angry at people who are being genuinely kind. Her suggestion reflected the family values that had shaped Sarah's character. Reverend Williams enthusiastically supported the idea. In all my years of ministry, I've found that most conflicts stem from misunderstanding. Personal connection can bridge almost any gap. He smiled at the couple. Besides, what better way to start your marriage than by turning an adversary into a friend? The wedding photographer, who had been quietly capturing the entire extraordinary encounter, asked permission to continue documenting what was happening. This is the most incredible wedding story I've ever witnessed, she said. Would you mind if I photographed your meeting with the neighbor? This is the kind of story that restores faith in humanity. Within minutes, a small delegation had formed. Sarah and Michael, still in their wedding attire, walked across the street accompanied by Officer Martinez, Sarah's parents, and Reverend Williams. Officer Johnson remained with the wedding guests, who were all watching with fascination as this remarkable day continued to unfold in unexpected ways. When Eleanor answered her door, she was clearly prepared to confront what she assumed would be hostile wedding guests. Instead, she found herself facing a bride and groom with genuine smiles, accompanied by a police officer, an elderly pastor, and a couple who were obviously the bride's parents. The delegation looked more like a welcoming committee than an angry mob. Mrs. Hutchinson? Sarah said softly, reading the name from the mailbox. I'm Sarah, and this is my husband, Michael. We just got married at the chapel across the street, and Officer Martinez told us you were concerned about the noise from our celebration. Her tone was respectful and apologetic, despite having done nothing wrong. Eleanor was clearly taken aback by the polite approach. She had expected confrontation and was prepared to defend her complaint aggressively. Instead, she found herself looking at a beautiful bride who was treating her with genuine respect and consideration. Well, yes, it has been rather noisy, she said, though her tone was already less harsh than it had been on the phone with 911. Michael stepped forward with a piece of wedding cake that Sarah's mother had quickly wrapped in a napkin. We brought you some cake as an apology, he said. We had no idea our celebration was disturbing anyone. The last thing we wanted was to upset our new neighbors. His sincerity was impossible to miss. Officer Martinez, recognizing an opportunity to turn this situation into something positive, decided to share part of Sarah and Michael's story. Mrs. Hutchinson, you should know that this wedding is extra special. Sarah and Michael have been through some very difficult times recently, and this celebration represents a new beginning for them after a long period of hardship. Eleanor's expression began to soften as she looked more closely at the young couple. There was something in their faces, a depth and maturity that suggested they had indeed experienced more than their fair share of life's challenges. What kind of hardship? She asked. her curiosity beginning to overcome her irritation. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances, and Sarah made a quick decision to trust their neighbor with the truth. We were wrongly accused of a serious crime and had to live as fugitives for months before we were cleared. Today isn't just our wedding day. It's also a celebration of our freedom and the chance to rebuild our lives. Her honesty was complete and unguarded. Eleanor's hand flew to her chest in shock. Fugitives, you too? She looked at this polite, well-dressed couple who had come to her door with cake and apologies, and tried to reconcile that image with the idea of them as criminals on the run. But you seem so normal, so nice. That's because we are normal people, Michael said with a gentle smile. We were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it took months for the truth to come out. We've learned not to take anything for granted, especially not the simple joy of being able to celebrate with family and friends without fear. His words carried genuine emotion that was impossible to fake. Reverend Williams, sensing an opportunity for ministry, added, Mrs. Hutchinson, sometimes God puts people in our path for a reason. Perhaps you were meant to meet Sarah and Michael today, to be part of their story of redemption and new beginnings. His words were gentle but profound, and they clearly resonated with Eleanor.